The moment Thomas Hayes walked into his kitchen that morning, he knew something was wrong. The house was too quiet. The scent of his wife's perfume was still lingering in the air, but the familiar warmth of her presence was gone. Then he saw her, Sophie, lying motionless on the floor, her face pale and lifeless, an empty bottle of pills beside her. The silence was deafening. He dropped the coffee mug from his hand, the contents spilling across the cold tile. Was it really suicide? Or had the woman he loved been hiding a dark secret that would destroy everything they had built? Thomas Hayes stepped into the kitchen, his mind preoccupied with the usual morning routine. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, but something was off. The kitchen, usually a place of calm, felt unnervingly still. He glanced toward the counter, expecting to find his wife, Sophie, preparing breakfast like she always did. But instead, his eyes locked onto a scene that would forever haunt him. Sophie lay sprawled on the cold kitchen floor, her body unnaturally stiff. Her face was pale, almost lifeless, and the empty pill bottles scattered around her told the gruesome story. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. A tight knot formed in his chest as his gaze shifted to the half-empty glass of water beside her. The weight of the moment settled in, and a chill ran down his spine. No, 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 no. The words barely escaped his lips, choked by disbelief and horror. He dropped the coffee mug in his hand, its contents splashing onto the floor. His knees buckled, and for a second, it felt like the world was closing in on him. Sophie was gone. His perfect wife, the woman who had stood by him through everything, was gone. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. The air was thick with tension as they carefully examined the scene, their eyes scanning for any sign of foul play. The room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cold, sterile place filled with questions that had no answers. Detective Carla Thompson, her face grim, crouched beside Sophie's lifeless body, her gloved hands carefully picking up the pill bottles. "It's clear," she muttered, "overdose. Looks like a suicide." Thomas stood at the doorway, his body frozen. "No. That can't be right," he managed to say, his voice raw, thick with emotion. He couldn't accept it. The idea of Sophie intentionally ending her life felt impossible, yet the evidence before him pointed in that direction. "Mr. Hayes, we need you to stay calm." Carla's voice was firm, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She too seemed reluctant to accept the conclusion. "We'll need to ask you a few questions." But Thomas couldn't focus. His mind was a blur of disbelief. Suicide. Sophie. He had never seen it coming. As the police continued their investigation, Thomas's grief began to twist into something darker unease. The idea of Sophie deliberately ending her life gnawed at him. But what if there was more to it? What if it wasn't an accident? Sitting alone in the living room, his mind raced through the fragments of their relationship. Had she been unhappy? He thought back to their recent conversations, the moments when Sophie had seemed distant, withdrawn. They had argued, sure, but nothing that would suggest this kind of desperation. A memory surfaced. Sophie had cried, late one night, as she told him, "I feel like I'm disappearing, Thomas. Like I'm invisible to you." The words haunted him now, a painful echo in the silence. He had brushed it off, told her she was just tired, but was she? Now, every little moment felt like a sign he had missed. The questions continued to haunt him. What had she been hiding? Thomas thought back to their life together. He had always believed their marriage was perfect, unbreakable, but now he wondered just how much he had overlooked. Flashes of their life together played in his mind. Sophie, the ever-supportive wife, the loving mother. But there were cracks. Small, insignificant at the time, but now they seemed glaring. She had grown distant in the past few months, and he hadn't done anything to close the gap. Then it hit him. Sophie's late nights, the whispers on the phone, the secretive glances. Had she been seeing someone else? Was it just the stress of their busy lives, or was there more? Had he missed the signs? Thomas couldn't shake the thought. Had I failed her? It gnawed at him. Every time he thought about Sophie, the question echoed louder. What if I could have seen it? What if I had been more present? His eyes welled up, the weight of his guilt settling deep in his chest. He stood at the window, looking out at the world that seemed so indifferent to his pain. The distant hum of life outside felt like a cruel reminder that the world moved on, even if his had come to a halt. I should have been there for her. I should have noticed. He paced back and forth, the unanswered questions tightening their grip on his mind. What had Sophie truly felt in those final days? And why hadn't he noticed? As the investigation unfolded, Thomas's view of their marriage began to shatter. The police uncovered truths about Sophie's life that Thomas had never known. Her affair with James, a close friend of his, came to light. Sophie's struggle with loneliness and guilt, hidden beneath the surface, became all too clear. Thomas felt like he was living in a nightmare. The woman he had trusted, the woman he thought he knew so well, had kept a part of herself hidden from him. She had been suffering, and he hadn't noticed. Detective Carla Thompson sat across from him, the weight of the evidence heavy in the air. "We've been looking into Sophie's past," she began. "There were things going on behind the scenes you weren't aware of. Things that might explain her choices." Thomas's stomach turned. He could hardly bear to hear it. James. He had trusted him, his best friend. And now, as the pieces fell into place, it was becoming clear that Sophie had been living a life he had never truly understood. Thomas Hayes was a man defined by his success. At 45, he had built a reputation in the business world that few could rival. He was sharp, focused, and driven by the need to achieve qualities that served him well in his career but left little room for emotional connection. His marriage to Sophie, his high school sweetheart, had been the bedrock of his life. She was everything he could ever want: loving, beautiful, and a devoted mother to their two children, Evan and Clara. She supported him through his long hours at the office, his endless phone calls, and his relentless pursuit of wealth. But as Thomas climbed the corporate ladder, something inside their marriage began to wither. The time they once spent together as a couple had dwindled, replaced by late-night meetings and early morning calls. Sophie, once a vibrant and outgoing woman, had become quieter, more reserved. Yet Thomas was too wrapped up in his own world to notice. Sophie had always been the emotional pillar in their home. But as Thomas buried himself deeper in work, the cracks in their relationship grew. She was lonely, and it wasn't a loneliness that was easy to talk about, especially with a husband who rarely saw it. Sophie was more than just a wife and mother. She was a woman with needs, desires, and fears that went unspoken. Sophie loved her family, and for a long time, she had convinced herself that love would be enough to make everything work. But the weight of her isolation became too much to bear. The long hours Thomas spent at the office left her to manage everything else: housework, the kids, emotional support, and with no one to turn to, Sophie's heart began to fracture. She found herself increasingly anxious, overwhelmed by the realization that her marriage wasn't what she had dreamed it would be. She would stare at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering where the woman she once was had gone. Who was she, really? And what had she become? Late at night, after the kids had gone to bed, she would lie awake in their too large, too empty bed. She'd scroll through old photos of them, reminiscing about the early years of their marriage when they were inseparable, when Thomas had held her close, when they were partners in every sense of the word. But now, those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Sophie tried to talk to Thomas once, a few months before her death, but he brushed it off as nothing more than stress. "You're just tired, Soph. We'll talk when things settle down." But things never settled down. The emotional gap between them grew wider, and Sophie became more desperate. She turned to friends, but even they couldn't fill the void she felt. One day, when her loneliness became too much to bear, she reached out to James, Thomas's old college friend. What started as an innocent conversation soon turned into something more. Sophie felt heard for the first time in years, and James, who had always been a shoulder to lean on, became more than just a friend. Thomas didn't notice the subtle shift in their dynamic. Sophie had grown more distant, but it was easy for him to ignore. Work consumed him, and his long days turned into weeks, then months, where he hardly saw his wife outside of the morning and evening routines. He assumed everything was fine. After all, Sophie was still there, still managing everything, still taking care of their children. But Sophie had started to feel like a ghost in her own home. She was invisible to Thomas. It wasn't just his absence, it was the emotional void between them that made her feel empty. She became more irritable, snapping at the kids, snapping at Thomas when he was around, though she never truly meant to. It wasn't that she hated him, it was that she hated what their marriage had become. One evening, while they were sitting across from each other at dinner, the silence stretched longer than usual. Sophie couldn't take it anymore. She put down her fork and met Thomas's gaze, searching for something, anything in his eyes. "I don't know who we are anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas didn't respond at first. He had been deep in thought about work, as usual. "What do you mean?" he finally asked, his tone distracted. "I feel like I'm disappearing, Thomas. Like I'm invisible to you," Sophie's voice cracked, betraying her hidden sorrow. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but it was too late now. Thomas blinked, his mind slow to catch up. "You're not invisible," he said, his voice distant. "You're just tired. I've been working long hours. We'll talk about this later." But Sophie knew this wasn't about being tired. It wasn't just about him working too much. She needed him to see her. She needed to feel alive again. Sophie's desperation to feel seen, to feel wanted, grew with each passing day. It wasn't just emotional intimacy she craved, but physical affection too, something she hadn't had in months. When James suggested they meet for coffee, Sophie agreed, needing someone to talk to, someone to listen. What started as a conversation over a latte in a dimly lit cafe soon turned into something more. James had always been charming, a man who knew how to make Sophie feel special. But she wasn't prepared for the flood of emotions that hit her when their conversation took a turn. It was a slow burn, the chemistry undeniable. And when their eyes locked, she knew this was what she had been missing. They kissed that day, the intensity of it shaking her to her core. She felt alive again. She felt like herself again. But in that moment, she also felt guilty. Was this betrayal? She tried to convince herself it wasn't. After all, Thomas hadn't been there, not really. He had left her with no choice. As weeks passed, the affair continued, and Sophie felt herself slipping further from the woman she once was. She wanted to stop, but she couldn't. James had become her lifeline, the only one who made her feel seen, made her feel real. Sophie's emotional state deteriorated quickly. Guilt gnawed at her every time she saw Thomas. She loved him, or at least she thought she did, but the emptiness inside her made it impossible to maintain the facade. She started taking prescription pills, small doses at first, just enough to dull the edge of her guilt and anxiety. The pills helped her forget, if only for a little while, that she was living a lie. But soon, the pills weren't enough. She took more, hoping they would numb the ache inside. It was a vicious cycle. One night, after another argument with Thomas about nothing and everything, Sophie retreated to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror, her face pale, hollow. "What have I become?" she thought, her heart heavy with regret. She swallowed another handful of pills, hoping they would take her somewhere, anywhere but here. The signs were there, and yet, Thomas couldn't see them. He noticed Sophie's erratic moods, her exhaustion, her growing distance, but he convinced himself it was just stress, nothing more. He couldn't bring himself to admit what was really happening. His wife was slipping away from him, and he had no idea how to stop it. Sophie's breakdown was slow, but it was inevitable. She stopped taking care of herself, stopped showing up for the things she used to enjoy. The children noticed, but they didn't understand. Thomas, lost in his own world, remained blind to the disaster unfolding in front of him. The perfect marriage he had once believed in was disintegrating, and he couldn't see it until it was too late. It had been a few weeks since Sophie's death, but Thomas couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. The police had closed the case, labeling it a suicide, but Thomas was no longer convinced. There were too many inconsistencies, too many moments that didn't add up. His mind kept drifting back to the night she died. The empty pill bottles scattered across the floor, the glass of water beside her, everything pointed to an overdose, yet something about it all felt off. Sophie had always been careful. She never took too much, always made sure the kids weren't around when she struggled with her pills. And yet, that night, it was too much. Far more than she would have ever taken on her own. Sitting in the living room, alone for the first time in days, Thomas pulled out his phone and scrolled through Sophie's old messages. As his eyes schemed through their conversations, something caught his attention, a message from James, sent late the night before Sophie's death. "Don't go through with it, Sophie. We'll figure this out. Just wait a little longer." His heart stopped. What did that mean? His fingers trembled as he clicked on the message again, but it was too late. James had deleted his number from Sophie's phone shortly before her death. Wait, a little longer. Thomas muttered under his breath. Why had James said that? Had she been planning something? Or was it a sign of something darker at play? Thomas hadn't spoken to James since Sophie's funeral. The man had barely made eye contact with him, too ashamed to face his best friend. But now, with this message weighing heavily on his mind, Thomas felt compelled to confront him. When James called out of the blue, Thomas could hardly breathe. The calm voice on the other end of the line felt like a slap in the face. "Thomas," James began, "I've been thinking about Sophie. I can't believe she's gone. I'm sorry. Sorry." That was all James could muster. But Thomas was no longer interested in pleasantries. "We need to talk," Thomas said sharply, his voice like ice. Now. They met at a local bar, far from the memories of their once close friendship. James, looking visibly uncomfortable, sat across from Thomas. "I know this is hard for you," James said, fidgeting with his glass. "But we can't change what happened." "You're right," Thomas replied, his voice quiet. "But I need to know what happened. Why was Sophie so desperate? Why did she end it like that?" James's eyes flickered with guilt. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice cracking. Thomas's anger flared. "Don't lie to me, James." His fists clenched. "I know about the affair. I know about your secret messages. What did you do to her?" James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. For a long moment, he remained silent. Then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. "I didn't mean for things to go this far, Thomas. Sophie, she was hurting, and I didn't know what to do. I never wanted her to die. She was in a bad place, and I thought if I could help her, maybe." Thomas's heart sank. "Help her? You're the one who pushed her deeper into the hole. You made her feel like she couldn't get out of it?" James looked down at his hands, clearly remorseful, but Thomas couldn't shake the anger that pulsed through him. Why hadn't James told him? Why hadn't he seen it? Days passed, but Thomas couldn't shake the conversation with James. It left him feeling more conflicted than ever. Was Sophie's death truly an accident? Was it a suicide? Or was there something more sinister at play? He couldn't stop thinking about the final days leading up to Sophie's death. The signs had been there, hadn't they? The secretive phone calls, the late nights, the guilt she had carried on her shoulders. That night, as he lay in their bed now too empty and too large for one person, he closed his eyes and remembered something Sophie had said to him weeks before her death. "I don't know how to keep pretending anymore. I'm not the woman you think I am, Thomas. I haven't been for a long time." At the time, he had dismissed it as just a fleeting feeling. But now, it felt like a cry for help. A cry he had ignored. He couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different. What if he had been there for her? What if he had been more present? Thomas realized, with a sinking feeling, that Sophie had been reaching out for help for a long time. And he had missed every single signal. The more Thomas thought about it, the more he began to understand. James had been a constant in Sophie's life, not just as a friend, but as a manipulator. Sophie had felt trapped, caught between her guilt for betraying her husband and her emotional connection with James. It was James's words that had led Sophie to believe she could escape her life. He had convinced her that running away from it all was the only option, even though that wasn't true. Thomas's suspicions deepened as he recalled the way James had spoken to him during their confrontation. There had been a level of guilt that wasn't just about Sophie's death, it was about something else. James had encouraged Sophie's feelings of entrapment and despair, feeding into her loneliness and convincing her there was no way out. It wasn't just an affair, it was an emotional manipulation that had pushed Sophie to the edge. The truth hit Thomas like a freight train. Sophie hadn't just been suffering from depression or loneliness. She had been suffocated by the emotional manipulation James had woven into her life, and in the end, it had become too much for her to bear. Thomas stood by the window, staring out at the world that seemed indifferent to his pain. His chest tightened as he thought about Sophie's final moments. How had she felt when she took those pills? Had she truly wanted to die, or had she simply believed she had no other choice? In that moment, everything became clear. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she was a victim of betrayal. Betrayed by the person who was supposed to love her the most, and by the one person who should have been her refuge. As the days passed, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there had been more signs he had missed. His mind kept replaying conversations, moments of quiet pain that he had dismissed as trivial. The way Sophie had looked at him in the weeks before her death, the way she had withdrawn into herself, seeking solace in someone else instead of him. He should have seen it. His guilt crushed him, and the more he thought about it, the more the questions piled up. Could he have done something? Could he have reached her before it was too late? Thomas finally understood that while he had been caught up in his own world, Sophie had been fighting a battle inside her. A battle he could have fought alongside her. Instead, he had failed her. Thomas had barely slept in the days since his confrontation with James. His thoughts constantly circled back to Sophie, the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. The question that haunted him remained unanswered: had he failed her? It was late one evening when the final revelation came. Sitting in the dim light of his study, Thomas reached for the stack of letters Sophie had written in the weeks leading up to her death. The letters were a window into her soul, a cry for help he hadn't understood before. As he read through the fragile words, one letter in particular stood out. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. It feels like I'm drowning, and no one is reaching for me. Maybe this is the only way out. I hope you'll understand, and maybe, just maybe, one day you'll forgive me for what I've done. But I can't keep pretending." Thomas's breath hitched in his chest. She had been reaching for help, and he hadn't even noticed. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a suffocating fog. It became clear now. Sophie hadn't just chosen to die, she had felt there was no escape. No way out of the emotional prison she had been trapped in. The affair with James, the guilt, the isolation, it had all led to this final act. He slammed the letter onto his desk, his hands trembling with a mix of grief and anger. How could I not have seen it? In that moment, Thomas realized that Sophie's death had not been a mere accident. It had been a decision made out of despair, a plea for relief from a pain that had festered far too long. A decision that was irrevocable. The days after reading Sophie's letter were a blur. Thomas felt like a man adrift in a sea of confusion and sorrow. He had never known such profound regret. His emotions twisted in knots: guilt, anger, and an overwhelming sadness. It was too much to bear. He couldn't help but question every moment they had spent together. Had it all been a lie? Had he truly loved her as he should have? As he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, his phone rang. The unfamiliar number on the screen jolted him from his thoughts. He hesitated before answering. "Mr. Hayes." The voice on the other end was calm, official. "This is Detective Miller. We've uncovered something in our investigation." Thomas's heart began to race. "What is it?" "There's something you need to see," Detective Miller said, her voice tight. "We've found new evidence, something that could change everything." Arriving at the police station, Thomas's legs felt heavy, as though every step carried him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't escape. He hadn't expected this. He thought the case was closed, that the truth about Sophie's death was set in stone. But Detective Miller's cryptic words had reignited a spark of fear and uncertainty. Inside the station, Miller sat across from him, her face serious. "We found another letter from Sophie. This one is different from the others. It's addressed to someone. Not to you." Thomas's eyes widened. "Not to me?" The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his pulse quickening. Detective Miller slid the letter across the table, and Thomas hesitated before reaching for it. The handwriting was unmistakable, Sophie's, but there was something raw and unguarded about the words this time. "James, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I need you to understand that I'm not leaving you because I want to. I'm leaving because it's the only way to stop the pain. I can't keep going back and forth like this. Please, don't hate me for what I'm about to do. I need this to end, and I don't know any other way." Thomas's stomach churned. The pieces were falling into place, but they felt like shards of glass, sharp and dangerous. Sophie hadn't just been struggling with her marriage, she had been emotionally torn between two worlds. One she felt trapped in, and another she had built with James. But now, it was clear James had been her escape, her source of comfort, the person who had fueled the very desperation that had led her to this final, irreversible decision. As the detective continued her investigation, it became clear that Sophie's death wasn't as straightforward as it had initially appeared. The more Thomas learned, the more disillusioned he became. The police had uncovered that Sophie had been in regular contact with James in the days before her death. Their phone records revealed frequent late-night conversations, conversations that were never fully explained, conversations Thomas had never known about. Detective Miller was sharp, asking pointed questions that dug at the heart of the matter. "Mr. Hayes, it's possible Sophie felt betrayed by you. She may have thought you were emotionally unavailable, leaving her to find comfort elsewhere. But her relationship with James, it wasn't just about sex. There was something deeper there. Did you know about it?" Thomas's jaw tightened. His anger surged, but beneath it was a deep, suffocating sense of loss. His trust in Sophie had been shattered, and now, he realized, there was no way to undo it. "I never knew," Thomas whispered. The words felt hollow, an empty confession. "I never knew what was happening until it was too late." In the aftermath of Sophie's death, Detective Miller pieced together the truth, revealing the depth of the emotional betrayal Sophie had experienced. Sophie's affair with James had not been a fleeting escape, it had been a lifeline. Sophie had relied on James for comfort when Thomas had failed to be there. She had turned to him, desperate for the affection and emotional connection she had been missing. But in doing so, she had sacrificed the very thing she had been trying to preserve, her family. The revelation hit Thomas like a storm. James hadn't just been an affair partner, he had been an emotional manipulator, preying on Sophie's vulnerabilities. Sophie had been desperate for a way out of her pain, and James had been there, offering her the illusion of escape. But Sophie's final message to James had been one of resignation. She had known, deep down, that she couldn't keep living this double life. She had known that the only way out was to end it all. Thomas finally faced James, his old friend, the one person who had been there when he couldn't. The anger burned in his chest, and he could feel it rising with each step he took toward him. James looked up, his face pale. "Thomas. I didn't mean for this to happen." "You didn't mean for it to happen." Thomas's voice was a low growl, barely able to contain his rage. "You destroyed her, James. You pushed her to the edge, and now she's gone. How could you do this to her?" James opened his mouth, but no words came out. His guilt was palpable, and his silence only enraged Thomas further. "I trusted you," Thomas spat, his fists clenching. "And this is what you did to her." James looked down, his hands trembling. "I never wanted her to die," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never thought it would get that far." The truth hit Thomas like a wave. James hadn't just been an affair partner, he had been the architect of Sophie's demise, slowly and steadily pushing her toward her tragic end.